Okay, hello chess players. Today we're going to be talking about the Queen's Gambit, beginning with d4, d5, pawn to c4. We're going to be talking about the Slav, and then after knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, we're going to be talking about the Semi-Slav, beginning with e6. And this video is going to be specifically dedicated to the Meran variation, beginning with the move pawn to e3. So if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So, this is one of the two sort of main lines that you have to deal with when you play the Slav. If you just have the Semi-Slav in your repertoire, you have to deal with this, and of course you have to deal with the bishop g5 line, which leads probably to like a Botvinnik Semi-Slav or something like that. So after e3, how do we play against the Meran? Well, it basically boils down to one really simple thing, is do you want to take on c4 at some point, or do you want to play for e5 without taking on c4 at some point? And that's really the two critical ways that you can play this position with the black pieces. So the first thing that you need to do, regardless of which way you choose, is just you need to develop a piece. You need to play knight on b to d7. And now the normal move here is queen to c2, and now the normal move is just to develop, to play bishop to d6. At this point, there's two main lines that white can play. There's the mainstream bishop to d3 move, which is setting up this threat of c5 and e4 at some point. And there's also this move, this crazy wild move, pawn to g4. Now, this crazy wild move, pawn to g4, got really popular back in the 90s. So my recommendation is just absolutely to have preparation against this move. It's not something obscure. Back when I was playing, it was like you almost ran into this exclusively. You had to have special preparation just for this, because most of your games in the Meran were in this, because it was just that popular. So I think the right way to go about playing against this is to play the move that Kasparov played and play d captures c4. The point is if you go into the complications with knight takes g4, in a very basic way, they seem to favor white. Even something as simple as rook g1, if you were to play f5 here, h3, knight on g to f6, rook takes g7, should be advantage white. So after g4, I think d takes c4. I think Kasparov's approach to this, that he took against Adams, this was Adams versus Kasparov, played in Germany back in 1992. This turned out really well for Kasparov. The idea is to create a square for your knight to go to. You want to create that d5 square for your knight to go to if white decides to make another pawn thrust with g4 to g5. So it makes really logical sense. So d takes c4, and in that Kasparov game, Adams continued with e4, of course, to prevent the knight from going to the d5 square, which turned out to be a mistake. Kasparov got an immediate advantage by playing pawn to e5. So the game continued g5, and then Kasparov's idea was e takes d4, and then we had knight takes d4, and then knight to g4, and of course both knights are focusing on the e5 square, so this knight on g4 does have a place to go. So after h3, the knight came back there, and then we had bishop e3, knight to c5, castles, and then the knight pops into the d3 square with check, king to d1, queen e7, rook g1, and Kasparov just finishes this game off beautifully, so I am going to show the rest of it. g6, bishop to g2, castles kingside, king a1, bishop f4, bishop takes f4, knight takes f4, h4, rook to d8, queen to d2, knight on c to d3, queen e3, bishop to g4, rook to d2, queen to e5, and of course black wins. And this was pretty normal for Kasparov back in the early 90s, when he basically beat everybody and won against everybody and didn't make any mistakes because he was just that good. So going back, so bishop d6, that's pretty much how we should respond to g4. We should just play d captures c4. E4 is a mistake. They should play something like bishop takes c4, and in this case we should reply with e5 immediately, which is undoubtedly what Kasparov has intended. The point is that if g5, we're going to bring that knight to d5. Our knight does have a square and everything should be fine. There's a bunch of games that we can look at from here. One game continued, bishop to d2, e takes d4, knight takes d4, castles, knight e4, knight e5, bishop to e2, bishop to b4, and black was doing really good. And actually, in this particular game, Gelfand versus Shirov, that was played in Monte Carlo back in 2004, black did eventually go on to win. So black was more than okay in this position. So that's how we should reply to this stuff, is we should play d takes c4 with the idea of e5 pretty much against any move, against bishop c4 or against d5. Bishop c4 is better. The positions after that are probably closer to equal than e4, where right after e5, black probably has an advantage. So going back, that's how we meet g4. That's the basic theory on it. This move bishop d3 requires a little bit more knowledge, because what white is trying to do is white is trying to set up this c5 with e4. And what's really important to keep track of is when white can get away with this, because this is really going to dictate what you need to do with the black pieces and how you need to continue. So here you can just castle, and the first question that you need to ask here is, can white get away with c5 and e4 right here? As it turns out, white really can't. And the short answer to why white can't is because white can't get away with it with his king in the center of the board. The complications don't favor him. So the long answer requires a little bit of understanding the tactics and the position. And okay, so let's just look at it. So we have c5. Let's just say white does it. c5, bishop c7, e4. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is black has this immediate pawn to e5, and that's what you'd have to play here. You really do have to play it. You have to play pawn to e5, and if you play pawn to e5 here, this position should be advantage black. One of the big points has to do with the king being located on the e1 square. So for example, let's say we have e takes d5, and then e captures d4. White wouldn't have a resource available to him like, say, pawn to d6, for example, because here bishop a5 pins the knight to the king, which is located on e1. And because of that, this should be decisive advantage black. So why does this matter? Why does this little nuance matter? Well, if white just waits one move, this type of thing isn't an issue. So for example, bishop to d3, castles. Let's say white castles. And then we have a lazy move like queen e7. We're setting up pawn to e5. Now white can get away with c5, bishop c7, e4, because now if we play the same idea with pawn to e5, we're going to have e takes d5, and we try the same thing. We play e takes d4. Now d6 just forks the queen and bishop. And there is no move that saves us here. Once we can sacrifice our bishop. That's about it. There's no king in the middle of the board. As a matter of fact, in a lot of lines, the rook can just come to e1 and gain tempo against the queen. But even after just bishop d6, c6, this is just decisive advantage white. Black is down a piece here. So this is not good. So that's basically the short answer. Now, the long answer is there's a big positional problem if you allow c5 here followed by e4, where white is castled. The big positional problem is since e5, for tactical reasons in all lines, doesn't really work, we have to do something else here. So the something else is d takes e4. And then knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop e4. That puts pressure on h7. We have to spend a move to play h6. And then white simply plays rook e1 and effectively prevents our pawn breaks. We can't play pawn to e5 at any point in a way that's safe. And we're actually in a lot of trouble here. This was played in Topalov versus Rodriguez, played back in 1997. And Topalov just ended up crushing Rodriguez. Rodriguez never managed to get off the three ranks. The game went very badly. It continued knight f6, bishop to d3, knight to d5, bishop to d2, queen f6, knight e5, knight f4, bishop takes f4, queen takes f4, rook e4, queen back to g5, rook to e1, bishop d8, pawn to h4, queen e7. Look at black's pieces. They look so wonderful. b4, queen to e8, rook to f4, b5, bishop h7, and then bishop g6, and that's the end of the game. White wins. So that's kind of the danger scenario that we have to avoid. So that basically means is once white castles kingside, right here, in the Meran, we have to make a very big decision here. We basically have one of two choices. Since white is now ready to play c5 followed by e4, we have to decide if we're going to play e5 right now, and it has to be right now, because this is a big threat. c5 followed by e4 is a serious threat, or if we're going to play d takes c4 here. Now, both of these choices are very reasonable, and they've both been played by top-flight competitors. So these are both moves that have been played by high-level players with the black pieces. So dc4 is a totally reasonable way to play chess here. D takes c4, bishop takes c4, and then you could continue with, like, say, b5. Bishop d3, bishop to b7, rook d1, b4, knight a4, c5 is following Navarra versus Carlsen, played in Wickensee back in 2012. That game continued d takes c5, rook to c8, queen e2, knight c5, rook c5, and Carlsen has equalized, and that game actually went to move 81 and still ended in a draw. So they fought it out, though. But this is very, very equal, and it's a draw. And that's basically the idea of d captures c4, is just to try to get an equal position, beginning with this d captures c4, b5, and then eventually engineering equality in the middle of the board. So what's our other option? Well, we can actually play e5 right away. This is reasonable. And this is actually the main line of our current world champion, Ding Liren, prefers to play this move. E5 is a totally acceptable move, and one of the main things that people try against this is they try to play cd5, of course, to isolate the pawn, cd5, but then usually they don't just play the IQP position. I mean, you could, of course, easily just play, d captures e5, and you're forcing an IQP, but for whatever reason, people don't really like this. They think black is doing okay. They try to spice things up a little bit with e4, so this is sort of the route that most of the people go down when they're playing against Ding Liren, but Ding seems to handle these positions perfectly okay. He continues with e takes d4, knight to d5, knight to d5, e takes d5, h6, and apparently black is doing all right here. For example, one game continued, knight takes d4, we had queen to h4, knight back to f3, queen to h5, just trying to get that pawn back on the d5 square. And once black does get that pawn back, black should be equal. So then we had bishop h7, king h8, queen f5, bishop f5. The knight goes to f6, again threatening to get the pawn on d5, but we have bishop back to c2, b6, rook to d1, bishop b7. Again, just focusing energy on that pawn. Bishop to b3, rook a d8. Bishop e3, bishop e7, rook e1, bishop to b4, bishop d2, takes. Eventually we get the pawn back. So the pawn is too far advanced to be held in the long term, so Ding just kind of builds up to it and eventually takes it. This was Nepomniachtchi versus Ding Liren, played back in 2020. But Ding Liren has had more than one game. We have this other game. We have a Manjaro versus Ding Liren, where after h6 we had bishop to h7 check. And then that game continued with king to h8, bishop f5, with a lot of the same stuff. Queen f6, rook d1, knight to b6, just targeting that pawn. Bishop c8, rook c8, queen e4, bishop c5, holding onto his own pawn there. Bishop to f4, knight to c4, rook e8. We had a capture on b2, bishop to e5, queen g6. This exchange happens. The knight comes back. So this position is decidedly messier. But eventually the dust settles. A lot of stuff gets exchanged. Ding manages to get a passed pawn over on the queen side. And now, with Ding's active pieces, he has more than enough compensation for everything that's going on. Although the ending of this game was actually pretty messy. It continued knight takes a5, knight takes d5, so he gets his pawn back, and then things do simplify, but in a very messy way right at the end. Like, he sacrifices here, and then he just ends up with a 3-on-2 that's a draw. Just b3, ab3, rook b3. And this particular 3-on-2 in a rook and pawn endgame is a very easy draw for the Grandmaster level. So that's how that game ended. That was Manjaro versus Ding Liren, played in St. Louis back in 2019. So that pretty much shows kind of what the options are. You can play for this immediate e5 against this Meran setup, or you can play for d captures c4. So essentially, when you're playing against the Meran, these are the things that you have to be prepared for. You have to be prepared for this line, and you either need to play e5 or d captures c4. And really, the other line that you need to be fully prepared for is this g4 line, and then here you're just going to play d captures c4 should be your main line, leaving that d5 square open. Against e4, you're going to play e5, and that should be advantage black. And against the correct move, bishop takes c4, you're going to play e5, and that should be complete equality. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you know how to play against the Meran variation now, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.